and the so-called Gang of Six, Senator Mark
Now, why did we include him?
Because I think he has some really important things to say.
Okay, as long as he's not talking about food. Senator, where are we today? How close are we to a deal?
Well, I think we're still going through a little bit of that kabuki dance. We're going to see if the Boehner plan gets out of the House. If it gets to the House, it's going to get voted down in the Senate. Then the Senate will take up Harry Reid's plan, which gives us a little bit more breathing room. And, you know, the question we have is, I look around town, and the only comprehensive bipartisan plan that makes the kind of hard choices everybody talks about, from tax reform to entitlement reform to real spending cuts, that gets us close to $4 trillion, is the so-called Gang of Six. And what we're saying, Democrats and Republicans alike, are, hey, this is the only, it may not be perfect, this is the only bipartisan plan out there. This ought to be in the process. If there's going to be a new commission, this plan ought to get a vote as well.
Well, you know, I would guess that David Walker and I would love that. I don't know about anybody else around the table, but that's not going to happen, Senator, is it?
Right.
Well, listen, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of limp through this August 2nd deadline. I don't believe we're going to default, but we're really, that's only the first step. The rating agencies have all said, if we don't get something close to $4 trillion, if we don't say, all right, both sides, Democrats, you got to put entitlement reform in the mix. Republicans, you got to put tax reform in the mix. We got to do some spending cuts on both domestic and defense. If we don't take the work that we built upon the Simpson-Bowles Commission and at least say, hey, come December, this plan ought to get a vote, as well as this commission, the chances are this new commission that may be created, the chances are will end up in deadlock. Well, if we don't have this chance, where are we going to be 6 months from now?
That's a good question. Where are we going to be 6 from now? A short-term deal, I think, adds more uncertainty.
Yeah,
Lawrence,
sure.
does it not?
Senator Warner, your governor has seemed to come to an understanding of what the debt ceiling is. Earlier in the year, he was saying, hey, you know, don't worry about it. You don't have to raise it. Now he realizes that it would hurt Virginia very, very badly if we somehow went into default. Virginia would go into default pretty much immediately thereafter.
Well, you're right, Larry. And, you know, our AAA bond rating, matter of fact, when I was governor, I had a 2-to-1 Republican majority. And even though Grover didn't quite like this, we actually forged a plan that raised revenues, cut spending. We had support of a third of our Republican House, half of our Republican Senate. And you know what happened when we did that? We got named the best managed state in the country. We kept our AAA bond rating. And actually, we got named the best state in the country for business. So putting a reasonable plan in place, getting your balance sheet in order, is something that I think most businesses would agree ought to be our top priority.
Dave Walker.
Senator, thank you for all the work that you've done in conjunction with the G6. I prefer that rather than Gang of Six. But the real key is this, all right? Realistically, you're not going to be able to make all the tough choices with regard to budget controls, tax reforms, defense cuts, Social Security, Medicare, etc. When realistically is that going to be able to begin to happen? Is it going to be after the 2012 election? What are your thoughts on that?
You know, none of this gets any easier after the 2012 elections. We keep clicking on $4 billion a day to our national debt every day we punt. So if out of this August 2nd debate is going to come a new commission that's going to report back at the end of the year, that all we're saying, with the only, again, bipartisan group in Washington at this point that really addresses the problem, when that commission reports, let us have a vote as well on this plan, this building upon the Simpson-Bowles plan, the so-called G6 or whatever else you want to call it. Hopefully it's going to be a gang of 50 at that point, not or 60 at least in this. And let us have an up and down vote on that. If we don't get the votes, so be it. But at least the American people will see a real choice that puts the real problems and some real solutions out there.
Grover, do you have a question for the senator?
Yeah, Senator. Back in January, the Gang of Six said that their job was to put in legislative form the Obama Deficit Debt Commission report. It's been 6 months. There is nothing written down in legislative language. The House is about to vote on the Boehner plan. It's actually written down in legislative language. They're actually voting on something. I got faxed to me a series of outlines and essays and frameworks and 3 pages that didn't add up to anything, and I was told that's the Gang of Six plan. When can the American people see the Gang of Six plan written down in legislative language so it can be scored and so people can know what you're talking about? Because it has a bunch of ranges in here, and then you kick it over to Harry Reid's appointed Senate Finance Committee to make the final decisions.
I don't know if you've read it, but what we do is
Yes.
we actually allow a bypass. So if the committees don't work, a equal number of Republicans and Democrats
Is
can
this
come
in
up with
legislative
actuarially
form,
sound.
Senator?
We have it about 80% in legislative form. And
Could
let
we
me
see
assure
it?
you, by the time there's a vote on a real plan, if this commission reports, great. But if they're not going to come out, if this commission ends up being deadlocked or both sides put on the kind of the regular suspects, we know that there ought to be an alternative that really deals with tax reform, entitlement reform, and the kind of spending cuts that get us close to the $4 trillion that most economists, left and right, will say is what we need to do to move that debt to GDP ratio in the right direction.
Senator, for 7 months, you haven't written it down in legislative form. We have a stack of papers saying all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. We don't have a piece of legislation written down. What have you done for 7 months?
I haven't seen a hatchet in his hands. He's not quite Nicholson in The Shine. I would not say there are ranges, but let's touch on one thing that you just mentioned. If the Senate doesn't do their job, this commission actually has a panel, I guess, of 6, 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and then they go at it?
That's what both the Boehner plan, and my concern with the Boehner plan is, not because of the politics around it, but the rating agencies have said you do a short-term extension, you're going to get a debt downgrade. That is the equivalent of a tax increase for every American across the country. A new commission, I hope they do great work. I can tell you this much: it takes a long time for people of different ideological views, when you got a Tom Coburn and a Dick Durbin working hours and hours in a room to put in both the enforcement mechanisms and the cuts and the changes you need. We've got something out there. We got a third of the Senate that signed on. Show me anything else in this town, at least, that's even close.
Mike Barnicle.
Senator, let me ask you a question. I mean, most people I've encountered during the course of an ordinary day, they think the work of the Senate, the work of the House with regard to this is truly preposterous. They can't think of another business they're involved with or deal with that would let everything go right to the deadline the way is happening now. So I want to ask you, what are the odds that someone is going to come into the room today, tomorrow, your room, the House side, and say, hey, you know what? Let's do something for the country.
Well, let me tell you, I think there's a whole lot of us that want to do that. I've been as frustrated, I can assure you, I felt like I was the crazy man over the last couple of months walking around with a sign saying the end is near. That frankly, I don't get laughed at quite as much because I've been saying we got to do that. What we, in our plan and any other plan, you're not going to rewrite the tax code in a major way in a 2-week period. We all knew that there had to be a process set up that would actually allow the changes. We have put that in place. And as much as Grover and some of the naysayers want to say otherwise, we've got most of the legislative language in place. We've got 36 senators, almost equal number of Democrats and Republicans, hit about that $4 trillion bogey mark in terms of deficit reduction. We put it out there. We've gotten arrows from both the left and the right. But if this debate continues to be driven by the extremes, well, whether we go off the cliff August 2nd or go off the cliff at the end of the year, we're going to be at the same place. We're going to have to find some way to get together.
Senator Dave Walker has a final question before we get there, though.
Sure.
Is there any way Americans can see the 80% of the language that you have down there, just so we can look at the details?
Listen, we've got that laid out. A lot of what we lay out are budget target cuts. What we lay out are enforcement mechanisms in terms of spending caps. What we say is we do give we do say there's not going to be an independent group alone that's going to solve this. You got to involve the various committees. But if the committees don't do their job, there's a bypass mechanism for an equal number of Democrats and Republicans to put together an actuarial equivalent.
Senator, you've done good work. Clearly, it needs to be in writing sooner rather than later. Here's my concern. No matter what you do with regard to committees, and no matter how good a work the G6 does, there's another group that's got to be engaged on this that doesn't get talked about. It's called the American people. All of the work that's been done so far with regard to Simpson Bowles and your good work on G6 has all been inside the Beltway. We desperately need a fact-based, nonpartisan, non-ideological discussion and debate. That's got to happen after this debt ceiling limit. And frankly, I hope that you will encourage the president and other congressional leaders to come together on that, because tough choices are going to have to be made, and the American people need to understand it, and they need to buy into it if we're for it to happen.
You're absolutely right. And what in a perfect world, and that's probably not Washington, but sure as heck what I'd like to see is we ought to have pairs of senators and House members, and let me assure you there are both Democratic and Republican House members as well that like what we're doing. We ought to be out across the country in a bipartisan forums the way Saxby Chambliss and I have already done in a couple locations, and take people through the kind of same facts that you have already and say, here are our choices. If there's a better way to do it, we'll have at it. But don't give me these extreme positions that walls off completely revenues or walls off entirely entitlements. You just can't get to the numbers we need if you draw those kind of lines.
Senator